work lives when something begins to shift. Not the big success stories people share after everything works out, but the quieter moments in between, when something feels different, even if you cannot fully explain it. Today, we're stepping into a conversation that many capable professionals experience, but very few people name. It's called the competence trap. And before we go further, I want you to pause for a moment and reflect on something. Have you ever become the person everyone depends on? The person people call when something breaks? The person who knows how the system actually works? The person who quietly fixes things so that the team can keep moving? You don't need to answer anywhere. Just notice your own reaction to that question. Because for many people, that role begins as recognition. You work hard, you solve problems, you take responsibility, and slowly people begin trusting you with more. At first, that trust feels good. You work, your work matters, your team depends on you, leaders rely on your judgment. But over time, something subtle can start to happen. The more reliable you become, the more the system begins to depend on you staying exactly where you are. And that's where today's tension begins. You may not be stuck because you lack ability. You may be stuck because your ability has become essential to the system. In other words, you're not stuck because you're weak, you're stuck because you're useful. In most teams, and almost every team, there are a few people who become the stabilizers. They understand the details, they keep projects moving, they solve problems before they grow actually bigger. But the question we want to explore today is this: what happens when the thing that made you valuable quietly becomes the reason you stop moving forward? Why do some of the most capable professionals find themselves doing more and more work, but not necessarily growing into new kinds of roles? And when does competence, something that once accelerated your career, slowly becomes the ceiling you cannot seem to move past? That's the conversation we're stepping into today. Let's open the room.
You know, as we were preparing for this episode, I kept thinking about a pattern that shows up in almost every workplace. Almost every team has that one person who becomes the stabilizer. Not always the most senior person or not the loudest voice in the room, but the person who quietly understands how things actually work. They know the details, the process, the history behind the decisions. And when something starts going wrong, people naturally turn to them.
And I think most people listening will immediately recognize that person. It's the person who gets messages like, hey, can you quickly take a look at this? Or you've handled something like this before, right? And sometimes the message is even simpler. Can you just fix this?
Exactly. And the reason people reach out to them is not random. It's because they are capable. They understand problems quickly, they move things forward, and they have already seen these complicated situations and they think clear. So, in the beginning, the role feels actually very positive, and you feel trusted, you feel valued, and people rely on you because they know things will get done properly.
And for many people, this is exactly how their careers start growing. When you are early in your career, being reliable is a huge advantage. You deliver consistently, you step in when something needs attention, and leaders begin to notice you.
Yes, because competence creates trust. When people see you that you can handle difficult situations calmly, they begin to depend on you. And that dependence often looks like recognition. More responsibility, more complex projects, more situations where people say, let's bring them in.
But there is also this subtle shift that begins because competence builds trust. And over time, trust can slowly turn into dependence.
And dependence changes how the system sees you. Instead of seeing you as someone who could move across different kinds of work, the system begins to see you as the person who keeps this particular part of the work running.
And the shift is usually very quiet. No one announces it. I mean, like, no one says, from today, you are the fixer. But through repeated situations, that role slowly becomes clear.
And sometimes the person themselves do not notice it at first because, from their point of view, they're simply doing what responsible people do. They're handling the team, solving problems, and they're making sure the work keeps moving.
But over time, the system begins to organize itself around that reliability. And that's when a new tension begins to appear because reliability builds trust, but dependence can quietly build ceilings.
Something else slowly begins to happen when you become the reliable person in a team. At first, people come to you because they trust you. But over time, that trust quietly turns into expectation. And the expectation is not always spoken out loud, it just sits there in the background. If something becomes confusing, you will figure it out. And if a project starts slipping away, you will help stabilize it. If a situation becomes tense, you will step in and smooth things out.
And sometimes the person themselves begins to carry that expectation too. They start feeling responsible for making sure nothing falls apart, even in situations where it may not actually be their role.
Exactly. You start noticing problems earlier than others. And because you know how to fix them, you step in and try quickly fixing them. Not because someone asked you to, but because you know the work will move faster if you handle it.
And that instinct comes out from a good place. You care about the outcome, you care about the team, you want things to work well.
But slowly, something important begins to change. You are no longer doing your work. You are also quietly stabilizing the system. You fix gap in the processes, you smooth communication between teams, you solve problems even before they become visible. And a lot of this work remains invisible.
From the outside, it simply looks like you're doing your job well. But on the inside, you may feel like you're carrying more responsibility than your role actually describes.
And the system slowly adapts to that because when someone reliable is present, the system becomes comfortable relying on them. People stop worrying about certain problems because they assume someone else will handle them.
And that's an important moment to notice because the system is not intentionally creating pressure, it is simply adjusting itself around your reliability.
Which brings us to a reflection you might want to sit with for a moment. Think about the last few months at work. How often have you stepped in and fixed something that technically wasn't your responsibility? Not because someone asked you to, but because you knew you could solve it quickly.
And when you step in like that, what usually happens next? Does the system slowly begin expecting you to do that again? Does the same kind of problem eventually come back to you?
There is no right or wrong answer here. But noticing the pattern can be powerful because the competence trap rarely appears suddenly. It builds slowly, one moment of reliability at a time.
And after a while, something interesting begins to happen. You become deeply valuable to the system, but in a very specific way.
You become the person who keeps things working. And sometimes, without realizing it, that role becomes very difficult for the system to move you out of. Let's think about a story. A few years ago, we worked with a team where there was someone who had become the quiet backbone of the entire operation. Let's call her Mira. Mira had been with the organization for several years. She understood the systems better than anyone else. She knew how different teams interacted. She knew the history behind almost every major process and decisions. If someone broke in the workflow, people called Mira. If a client escalation happened, Mira stepped in. If two teams were stuck in a disagreement, Mira somehow helped resolve it.
And the interesting thing about people like Mira is that they rarely announce themselves. They're not always the loudest voice in the room, but everyone knows the work moves more smoothly when they're involved.
Exactly. And because she was so capable, people trusted her with more and more responsibilities. New projects came her way, complex problems landed on her desk, leadership appreciated her reliability. And from outside, it looked like she was doing incredibly well.
But something interesting happened when the organization began discussing the next leadership role in that function.
Yes. And during those conversations, the leadership team asked a very practical question. If Mira moves into a new role, who will run the system she's currently holding together? And suddenly, the room became quiet because the honest answer was no one else fully knew how to.
So, even though everyone expected and respected her capability, the system had quietly become so dependent on her staying exactly where she was.
Exactly. Mira had become indispensable to the workflow, but that indispensability made it difficult for the organization to imagine moving her elsewhere. And that is one of the most subtle versions of the competence trap.
Because competence builds trust. But when a system becomes too dependent on one person's competence, it can quietly limit how far that person moves next.
That experience forced me to ask a question I had never thought about before. What is the difference between being indispensable and being promotable? Because for a long time, I assumed they meant the same thing. If someone is indispensable, it means they are valuable to the team. Their work matters, people depend on them. So it feels natural to believe that being indispensable should automatically lead to growth. But little did I know, these two things are not the same.
And this is where many capable professionals get confused because the signals they receive sound very positive. You're critical to the team, we trust the work that you do, and mostly the complex work that you do, we rely on you. All those sound like compliments, and they are. But they also reveal something about how the system actually sees you.
Exactly. When someone becomes indispensable, it means the system depends on them staying exactly where they are. Their presence keeps things stable. Their knowledge holds important pieces of the work that they are doing, and moving them would create disruption.
But promotable means something slightly different. Promotable means the system believes your value will expand if you move into a different role. The system believes the work will still function without you and that your thinking will create greater value somewhere bigger.
And that leads to a difficult but important realization. If the system cannot function without you, the system cannot afford to move you.
That line can feel so uncomfortable because many high performers spend years becoming the person everyone depends on. They solve problems, they build expertise, they become central to how the work happens.
But that centrality can also create a trap. The more the system relies on you personally, the harder it becomes for the system to imagine operating without you. And growth often requires exactly that. The system must believe it can run without you in your current role.
There are a few signs that someone might be indispensable to the current system, but may not yet be seen as promotable. For example, if most problems eventually escalate to you, if there are parts of the work that only you fully understand, if the team struggles when you step away, even for a short time.
Or if people consistently say things like, we need you exactly where you are. You hold this whole thing together. You are the one who keeps everything running. Again, these words are meant as appreciation, but they also reveal how the system depends on you.
This might be a useful moment for another reflection. Imagine you stepped away from your current role for 2 weeks, not answering messages, not stepping in to solve problems. What parts of the work would struggle immediately?
And another question to sit with is this: in your current role, Are you mainly valued for what you personally execute or for how you shape the work around you? Because the first creates indispensability, but the second creates promotability.
And that distinction becomes even more important when competence begins to create a pattern. A pattern where the more capable you become, the more the system gives you the same kind of work. Which brings us to the next part of the competence trap.
Let's stay with that idea for a moment. What happens when competence becomes the main way the system understands your value? Because this is where the competency trap becomes starts clearer. When someone consistently executes well, the system will naturally give them more executional work. A difficult project appears, they handle it well. Another complicated situation comes up, they handle that too. And slowly, a pattern forms.
You're right. The better you become at execution, the more execution the system gives you, because this is where the system has already seen you succeeding.
Absolutely. And competence attracts more of the same work. And if you are excellent at solving operational problems, the system will continue bringing operational problems to you. And over time, this creates a loop. You become more capable, but you also become more deeply tied to the same kind of work.
And while this is happening, something else is quietly shifting. Your reputation becomes very clear. You are known as the person who gets things done, the person who can handle complexity, the person who steps in when things need to be fixed.
Which again, like it sounds positive reputation, but the question is, what kind of work does that reputation attract? Because execution reputation attracts execution opportunities, not always the strategic ones.
And strategic conversations often happen in different spaces. Spaces where people are discussing direction, trade offs, long term decisions. What should change next year? What the organization should actually continue building or build next?
If most of your time is spent solving operational problems, you may not naturally be present in those spaces where strategy is discussed. Not because someone doubts your ability, but because the system has become used to seeing you in a very different role.
Which is where competence can slowly start becoming a ceiling. Not because you lack ideas, not because you lack capability, but because the system has learned to depend on your execution.
This might be another useful reflection. In your current role, does growth mostly mean handling more work, or does it mean thinking about work differently?
If growth mostly means more tasks, more projects, and more responsibility within the same type of work, then the system may still be seeing you primarily as an executor,
But leadership growth often requires a different shift, moving from being the person who solves the problem to becoming the person who changes how problems are solved. And that shift is not only about responsibilities, it's about identity. Because stepping away from execution can feel uncomfortable for people who are actually good at it, which is what we want to explore next.
so far, we've been talking about patterns inside teams and organizations. But at the center of the competence trap, there is also a personal shift that needs to happen. Because many capable professionals build their identity around being the person who gets things done. You solve problems quickly, you understand the details, you are the person people rely on when things get complicated. Over time, this becomes part of how you see your own values. Yes, and that identity is wrong. Execution is important. Teams need people who can turn plans into real results. But leadership growth often asks for a different kind of contribution, not only doing the work, but also shaping how the work should happen.
And this is what we call the doer to designer shift. A doer focuses on completing tasks well. A designer focuses on building systems where the work can happen better.
And that shift usually requires changing a few habits that once made you successful. Because the behaviors that help someone become an excellent executor are not always the same behaviors that help someone grow into leadership.
There are three shifts that often happen in this transition. The first shift is from solving problems to understanding why the problem keeps appearing. Instead of asking, how can I fix this quickly? You begin asking, why does this problem keep happening?
The second shift is more from doing the work to designing the work. This means stepping back and asking, how should this system work so that the team can succeed even when I'm not involved every step of the way?
And the third shift is from being needed to building capability. Instead of being the person who solves everything personally, you begin helping others develop the ability to solve those problems too.
And let's be real, that shift can feel uncomfortable at first. Because when you're used to being the most capable person in the room, stepping back can feel like losing control.
Absolutely 100% on you. And for many high performers, execution feels safer. You know you're good at it, you know you can deliver results. But designing systems and shaping direction involves more uncertainty.
Which is why this moment often becomes the real turning point. Not when someone learns a new skill, but when they allow their identity to expand beyond being the person who fixes everything.
A helpful reflection here is this: think about the work you're doing today. What are the tasks you continue to handle personally because you know you can do them well, even though someone else in your team could probably learn to do that?
Because sometimes growth begins the moment we stop proving how capable we are and start creating space for different kind of thinking.
And that brings us to the final piece of this conversation. If someone realizes they may be in the competence trap, what can they actually do to move beyond it?
So, if someone is listening to this conversation and realizing, I might be in the competence trap, the natural question, as said by Vidya, is what do you actually do about it? Because the answer is not to become less capable, and it's not to stop caring about the quality of your work. The shift is about changing how your capability shows up inside the system.
Absolutely. Escaping the competence trap usually requires three small but important shifts. The first is reducing operational dependency. If too much of the work depends on you personally, the system will naturally keep you exactly where you are. So, the goal is to slowly make parts of the work less dependent on you.
That might mean documenting processes. It might mean training someone else to handle responsibilities you currently manage. It might mean letting someone else run parts of the project that you normally take over.
And this can feel uncomfortable, as we have seen. Because when you are used to being the fixer, stepping back can feel like you are lowering the standard. But the real goal is not perfection here. The goal is sustainability. A system that only works when you are present is difficult to grow beyond you.
The second shift is making your thinking visible. Many capable professionals do excellent work, but their thinking usually stays invisible. Leaders see the outcome, but they don't always see the reasoning behind it.
And leadership growth often depends on visible thinking. That means sharing how you approach problems, explaining the trade offs you are noticing, speaking about patterns you see in the system, and not just delivering results quietly.
Because when leaders see your thinking, they begin to imagine you operating at a larger level. They don't just see the work you completed, they see how you approach complexity.
And the third shift is moving from fixing problems to building systems. Instead of stepping in and solving the same issue over and over again, you begin asking, why does this problem keep appearing? What would be needed in order for the change to make sure that this doesn't go into an escalation for the team?
This is where the identity really begins to change. You are no longer just the person who makes things work, you become the person who makes the system work better.
And when that shift begins to happen, something interesting changes. The system is no longer depending on you for everyday solutions. Instead, you are valuable when it comes to expanding the system beyond just execution that you personally oversee.
Which is often the signal leaders are looking for when they consider someone for the next level. It's not just capability, but the ability to shape how the work happens for everyone else. So, as we come to the end of this conversation, let's return to the idea we started with, the competence trap. It is one of the most subtle career patterns people experience because it doesn't come from failure. It often comes from doing your work extremely well, from being responsible, being dependable, from being the person who steps in when things need to be handled properly. These are all strengths. Teams need people who care about the work and take ownership. But sometimes the very strengths that help us grow early in our careers begin to shape the role we continue to play. If you are the person who always fixes things, people begin to see you as the fixer. If you are the person who always keeps everything stable, people begin to see you as the stabilizer and the one to depend on. And slowly, without anyone deciding it directly, your role becomes centered around holding the system together. There's nothing wrong with that role, but growth eventually asks a very different question.
Not only how well you can do the work, but how might the work itself change? That shift can feel uncomfortable because it sometimes requires stepping away from the place where you feel the most confident, letting others take on work that you know you could do better and faster, allowing the system to learn without you fixing every other gap, and spending more time thinking about direction than immediate solutions. So, before we close today's conversations, here's something I want you to reflect on. Where in your work are you being valued mainly? Is it for your ability to execute? And where might there be a space for you to start shaping how things are done? Because sometimes the question is not whether you're capable, sometimes the question is whether your capability has become so familiar that it quietly keeping you in the same place. And here's where the uncomfortable truth is. If the system cannot function without you, the system cannot afford to move you.
So, the real transition may not be about proving your competence again. It may be about redesigning how your competence actually shows up. This is the transition room, and transitions rarely begin with failure. They usually begin the moment we realize that the strengths that built our success may also be asking us to grow again. So, we'll see you in the next conversation. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.